Anyone who uses the phrase, "I just care about women and children," would care very deeply about the implications of this data that Irene Fisher has within her organisation. Irene was never consulted about the intervention. Her expertise and leadership in her community were overlooked. Her criticisms of the intervention have seen her targeted by the government, who sought to discredit her and her data. She was also worried that speaking out about the health data would mean that her health services would be targeted for funding cuts. She often tells me she's burnt out, that additional money that could have been given to assist her organisation is now being given to non-government organisations rolling out the intervention. The intervention has increased the administration load on her organisation, and she tells me she needs a break. If she does go, her community is going to lose one of its most valuable assets. Irene's observations about the failure of the intervention to achieve improvements are backed up by the most recent whole-of-government report monitoring the situation in the Northern Territory, titled Closing the Gap in the Northern Territory. Covering the period from January to June this year, it showed reported child malnutrition is up, despite the 85 licensed stores, the 15,000 basic cards and the $200 million of income being managed. Total enrolments and school attendance rates are marginally down since the beginning of the intervention. Alcohol, drug and substance abuse incidents have increased. Domestic violence-related incidents have increased, and breaches of domestic violence orders have increased despite a greater police presence. They're the government's figures. The Northern Territory intervention has perpetuated many myths about human rights. One myth is that policies either protect women and children or they protect against racial discrimination. The Howard government justified the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act as part of the intervention by claiming that it was necessary in order to enact policies that would stop abuse of women and children. The Rudd government have continued to justify the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act and other human rights breaches under the intervention by continually using the rhetoric of "we just want to protect women and children." But it is simply untrue to say that you either have policies that protect against women and children or you have policies that protect against racial discrimination. This is a false dichotomy, and any half-competent government should be able to develop policies that protect women and children and are not racially discriminatory. The second human rights myth around the intervention is the idea that rights are only abstract concepts. It has become fashionable in the pro-intervention, pro-welfare reform quarters to use slogans such as "you can't eat rights" or "you can't eat the Constitution" to justify a decision to trample on human rights. In the same way that unions use the idea of rights to improve the conditions of Australian workers, even using a campaign of Your Rights at Work to counter work choices, and in the same way that the struggle for equality for women has focused on notions of fundamental rights, so too have Aboriginal people used the language of human rights and relied on the notion that there are international human rights standards to which we're all entitled. It's wrong to assert that the protection of rights are merely the luxury of the elite, meaningless and without practical effect. Human rights frameworks provide very practical outcomes. The Racial Discrimination Act does not just instil a principle of non-discrimination into our society. It provides a mechanism through which people who feel that they are being discriminated against on the basis of their race can make a complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission. It gives an avenue of redress when a wrong has occurred, and the process, importantly, allows for policies and processes to be improved to make them compliant with the standards of non-discrimination that the Act expects. The same is true of anti-discrimination legislation and rights of appeals under the Social Security Appeals Tribunal. The due process rights that every other Australian enjoys if they feel that they are being treated unfairly do not exist for those, like Barb Shaw, made most vulnerable to the heavy-handed government policy as part of the intervention. Some people say about human rights breaches in the Northern Territory intervention, well, it's complicated. Some Aboriginal people are for it and some are against it. And to these people I would ask, would you be so ambivalent about whether this is right or wrong if the person arguing that the suspension of human rights protections was white rather than black? Of the things that have been positive about the intervention, additional money for health and promised for housing, additional police in some communities, all of this could have been done without the need to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act. The real question is whether it is appropriate for policies concerning Aboriginal people to breach international human rights standards and our own legal standards of protection against racial discrimination. And this is not just a question for the Aboriginal community. The issue of whether Australia's laws should breach international human rights standards is one that should matter to all Australians. After all, Aboriginal people were not the ones who enacted the Northern Territory intervention legislation. The Australian Parliament did that. Germaine Greer has been one of the few Australians who has looked at Indigenous issues and, in her writings, asked non-Aboriginal Australia to look at its complicity in the current situation of Aboriginal people. She has attempted to ask the question of Australians, look what we've done, what are we going to do about it? She is usually met with uncomfortable silence or her questions fobbed off to Aboriginal commentators. But the treatment of Aboriginal people becomes a litmus test against which we can judge ourselves as a country. It doesn't matter if policies work for those who are already well off. The test is whether they work for Barb Shaw's family, Richard Downes's community and for Irene Fisher's clients. It is patronising for a Minister of Indigenous Affairs to keep telling people like Irene Fisher, Barb Shaw and Richard Downes that she cares about women and children, while she ignores their real and pressing concerns about the impact of government policy on their lives. We all care about women and children. That is not the contested ground. The contested ground is how to best ensure that Aboriginal communities are safe and strong and children are given the best opportunities for a better life. In my written paper that accompanies this lecture, I outline the fact that research in Australia and in Indigenous communities in North America shows consistently that the best way to lessen the socio-economic disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is include Indigenous people in the development of policy and the design and delivery of programs into their communities. And I map out alternative and proven ways for improving socio-economic outcomes, including adequate funding and a focus on capacity building. Indigenous policy has often been targeted at intervention, at emergency. It rarely seeks to look at the underlying issues. Addressing disadvantage requires long-term solutions, not just interventions. And rather than always reacting to a crisis, a long-term sustained approach requires addressing the underlying causes of disadvantage. This means resourcing adequate standards of essential services, adequate provision of infrastructure and investment in human capital so that communities are developing the capacity to deal with their own issues and problems and have the skill sets necessary to ensure their own well-being. Toni Morrison once said that the function of freedom is to free someone else. Those words resonate deeply with me. As an Aboriginal person who is part of the emerging middle class within my own community and who understands the struggle of the generations before me to gain better rights to education and health and equal access, it sums up the obligation to fight for those less fortunate than ourselves. The people at the Aboriginal Tent Embassy did not fight so that my generation would still be protesting on the lawns of Parliament House. They wanted Aboriginal people to become doctors and lawyers, accountants and nurses, welfare workers and judges, so that we could improve our lives, not just for our own families, but for others within the community. I might look middle class and assimilated to outsiders, but my father and his generation did not want us growing up to be white. It was important to him that I knew my culture, my place in the world, that I understood the cultural values of reciprocity, interrelatedness to the environment, obligation to country, respect for elders. He wanted me to know my totems and my dreamings, and he knew that without this, I would not be complete. My education, my success, my ability to be articulate are the result of the determination of Aboriginal people the generations before me. The Coopers, the Maynards, the Fergusons, the Pattons, the Foleys, the Mansells, and the Aboriginal women who stood beside them and behind them. They did not want to surrender their Aboriginality to gain equality with non-Aboriginal people. They saw a great injustice in being treated as inferior and being denied basic rights to health, housing, education and employment. But they also wanted to protect their identity and their culture, to keep Aboriginality strong. They believed that this vision of improved socio-economic circumstance and maintenance of culture could be the legacy of an improved human rights framework for Aboriginal people. Thank you.
Congratulations, as usual. Clear, well argued, undeniable. We are with Pen tonight, and I'd like to move us in a slightly different direction about articulacy and what it is that we can articulate. Amongst the news we've had this week, which is not news in any real sense, is the shocking statistic which has been noticed around the world, and Australians don't get this, that 24% of our prison population is Aboriginal. You could have that prisoner on that chair. Now, one of the things I see as causing this, now you may disagree with me, and that's what we're here for. It seems to me that what's going on is that we are not understanding Aboriginal protest. It is always represented as simple delinquency and criminality. One of the reasons we don't recognise it is that the people who are acting up and getting themselves into trouble cannot express themselves. And actually being incapable of expressing yourself is a pretty common phenomenon, especially where crimes of violence are concerned. You have people who have literally no language. Now, from having hundreds of languages, including very sophisticated diplomatic languages for negotiation between groups, between warring groups, between more distant relatives and so on, arriving at agreements about common resources, for example. From having all these oral languages, Aboriginal people now have virtually none. Some people still speak language, but we know now that there are very few of them. And even if we look at people like the Yolngu, many have a working language, rather than something that can be derived from reading somebody's translation of the Bible at some point, we see that the same problems are occurring there. So that what I'm interested in is the sense in which there is no forum for Aboriginal people. They don't have access to print, even supposing that they had the language for print. They're completely scuttled when it comes to putting their own point of view. And God knows they try. They try desperately hard. Now, Pen is about writers. Writers are already extremely privileged people. They have a pen. They can write. And in most cases, they have access to some sort of publication. The difficulty in considering the Aboriginal people of this country and how we're ever going to hear what it is they have to say to us is that they have no pen. I'm not a member of Pen, and that's why. I've had big fights with Salman Rushdie because I say to him things like, I think writers are better adapted for prison than plumbers. And he doesn't like that. He gets incredibly cross because he thinks he's about the most important person in the world. If I then say to him, what's more, I think I would do quite well in prison compared to a brutalised Aboriginal 16-year-old. Put me in prison by all means. Stop locking these people up. Now, where do we go? What can we do about this? Because the other thing is that the world is watching, and it's a national disgrace. We should be humiliated.
Well, Germaine, there's a lot in that. So let me just start to unpack some of what you're saying. I think that there is a problem that young Aboriginal kids now see it as a rite of passage to get arrested. It's very much a part of the anti-authoritarian view that many Aboriginal people have. It's a rebellious thing, as you say. And there's probably more, in some communities, there's more social acceptance. It's very sad for me to say this, but more social acceptance for kids getting arrested and locked up for the first time than there is in them achieving in high schools. And that is a real reflection of where we are as a community. But I think one of the challenges around these incarceration rates, and there are lots of issues I want to unpack in what you've said, but one of the things I'm reminded about when you talk about that statistic is that it's an area where we've done a lot of research. There's been a Royal Commission, there are blueprints, and governments have a pretty good idea about what works and what doesn't work. And instead of looking at some of the things that have been really strong influences in giving Aboriginal youth an alternative pathway, and you'd be familiar with things like the circle sentencing, where they go to an elders tribunal and they get a punishment that will teach them about responsibility with the community, like they have to fish for 100 hours with an elder. That gives them a different pathway. They start to learn about their culture, they start to learn about responsibility, they learn about reciprocity, and that gives kids a different pathway to prison. We don't offer those sorts of alternatives to Aboriginal people coming into contact with our system. We've never resourced them. We've never committed to setting up that as an option. And instead, on the one hand, while governments, throw their hands up and say these statistics don't seem to get any better, most of them run law and order campaigns that increase the instances where bail is refused, that have harsher sentences, that we've seen mandatory sentencing, all of those sorts of things, where it's absolutely known that the impact of those changes is going to hit most heavily on Aboriginal people, and governments do them anyway. So I think there's a systemic problem around some of those things. But the issue of voice that you raise, I think, is a really, really crucial one, and there are some really interesting cultural aspects to it too. I think one of the things that I love about Aboriginal culture and being brought up in this culture is it's got that strong culture of storytelling. You've got the cultural stories that people call Dreamtime stories, but our law is taught through stories, our responsibility through stories. When we like to talk about things, we like to tell the story, those sorts of things. And so I think that there really is the potential for great storytelling. And not all Aboriginal people have been able to adapt with that skill set to be able to articulate it in writing. And I think also too, structurally and systemically, we've been very reluctant as a country to give a voice to Aboriginal people. On very few occasions do we see national representative bodies, like ATSIC was the last one that we had. It wasn't the best national representative body, but at least people had a place where they could put forward an alternative point of view. And one of the things that I find most marked is how disempowered people feel because they can't get that alternative view out. When the Northern Territory intervention first got announced, we had people who rang up at the university, because we're an Indigenous centre and people ring us with all sorts of things, and they kept saying to us, well, what can we do about this? And the short answer was nothing. The legal system is such that there's nothing you could do. But they kept saying, well, how can we get our story out? How can we get our story out? And the fact is, if the mainstream press, if the Australian isn't interested in their story and it wants to spin a different story about how great the intervention is, these voices get lost. And even the powerful voices like Irene's and Barb's and Richard's, who I referred to, who are the articulate leaders of their communities, find it very hard to get the audience, so that even if they did have a pen to write things down, their ability to get their message out is limited. And I don't have the answer to this, you might know this better than me, but surely part of that is the lack of willingness for people to listen. It's not that we don't want to tell the stories, we're storytellers, that's what we do. But it's the failure to listen and the failure to provide a forum.
Well, I have argued in the past that we have to create some possibility for political action, because otherwise self-destructive behaviour, particularly on the part of men in Aboriginal communities, will just become lethal. In fact, it's arguable that it's lethal already, because we're not getting anywhere trying to stop it. And deaths are occurring in and out of prison at a rate that's completely unacceptable. But when you talk about the alternatives to law and order as whitefellas see it, I think it's important to realise that that itself is in some ways unacceptable, because it's accepting a higher authority than one's own culture and one's own system of values, especially if you're unimpressed by it, especially if you think that the people who are trying to tell you how to behave are greedy, acquisitive, destructive, and so on. I mean, I'm thinking of two little boys who get on a bus in Glebe and won't pay their fare. And the bus driver says, then I can't move the bus. So they say, well, don't move the bus. We haven't got any money and we're not moving. And they're two Aboriginal boys, and I can just see why they did it. This is where the rights come in. Because what they're saying, they're actually making a discourse about rights. They're saying, this is our country and we'll tell you. You're our servant. You drive us in this bus. Now, I don't know what happened ultimately, whether the bus could still be there. But this, when we're talking about urban Aboriginal people in particular, we can't actually send them off for 100 hours fishing. That would be many men's idea of total bliss. But it isn't, unfortunately, available. But surely the rights argument intersects with the protest situation. And we actually have a duty, if we believe in freedom of speech, we have a duty to facilitate that speech. And we haven't done it, and we've almost got to a stage where we can't do it.
The point I want to pick up on what you've said, and it might seem like a bit of a tangent, but for me I think it's kind of part of the heart of the problem really that I didn't touch on in my lecture, and I know that you get this stuff. It's about the fact that one of the challenges we have is that often a lot of the solutions about how things can be improved around, you know, what works in improving health, etc., what works in relation to rehabilitating kids, often means we have to re-engage more with Aboriginal culture. Bilingual language is a really good example of that. It's much easier to teach children the basics of English if you teach them in their own language first, teach them cultural messages that they can understand first, and then when they're able to spell their own Yolngu language in using the same letters, then they can read English much better. But the barrier to a lot of these effective mechanisms has been this demonising of Aboriginal culture. So for many Aboriginal people, we're sort of in a bit of a bind when we want to argue that we think the solutions are about greater interaction and connection and understanding and facilitating of culture, because we've been so demonised by particularly right-wing media and Aboriginal affairs ministers who look at that dysfunction in Aboriginal communities that you've described, that lethal level of violence, and they look at that and say, well, that's Aboriginal culture. They don't look at it and say, that's what happens when Aboriginal culture starts to disintegrate and you lose the moral authority, and this is what you get left with. I mean, that's part of your thesis in Rage. And I think it's a really important tension that we need to confront, because I think that there is a demonising of Aboriginal culture, and it seems to me that there are a lot of solutions, not just in relation to what Indigenous culture has to offer Aboriginal people about how we can better deal with some of these solutions, like teaching our children more effectively, living in healthier environments. But it seems to me that there's a lot of wisdom within Aboriginal culture, like reciprocity, interrelatedness to land, that gets completely overlooked because of that view that Aboriginal culture is inferior, it's violent, and it's part of the problem, not part of the solution. I think that's a real challenge in the pathway forward, not just in terms of how do we keep Aboriginal communities strong, how do we make the case that there's culture, but I think that that failure to respect Aboriginal culture and the failure to understand it is actually going to be a long-term problem for non-Indigenous Australia, who are never going to feel comfortable in this land unless they embrace Aboriginal culture, who are not going to understand the environment unless they understand Aboriginal culture. And I know I've said this to you before, but you know, my vision for Australia, when people ask me what would reconciliation look like to me, it would be an Australian culture where Aboriginal culture was the central culture of Aboriginal Australian cultural life. And I think we've got a long way to go.